Magical Drop F has to be the most difficult game I've tried to break down compared to anything I've made a video out of. This is like my 4th or 5th draft of this. For one, the game is 100% Japanese and was never translated or localized in any form into English. Secondly, there does not seem to exist a fan translation in any form. Not even a text file of everything translated exists. And lastly, this game contains a pseudo RPG adventure mode for the single player. As in, there's an entire story mode with explorable maps, characters to talk to, and battles to finish, all attached to the rest of the standard package of what you would expect in a Magical Drop game. It's also far more difficult to play through for all of these reasons. There also does not appear to be any sort of guide that exists for all the in-depth mechanics, with the exception of a couple ancient sources I managed to find, that without, I would not have been able to get as far as I did. So let's start from the top. Data East. It's nearly the end of the 90s, and the arcade scene by this point in time has not only dwindled, but also taken a huge hit from the console gaming market. This was much more obvious to see in the States, as arcades everywhere were becoming phased out, only to exist as part of the other entertainment businesses like restaurants and movie theaters. But in regards to Japan, arcades were still flourishing, but competition was becoming more and more challenging to stay relevant. With how densely populated the cities of Japan can be, and the optimal infrastructure done to maximize use of every square inch of a location, along with public transportation being such a common use among all citizens, it makes sense arcades would still be growing. This means people are always kind of waiting for things to happen, whether that be a train to arrive for work, or a friend to arrive on a train for dinner, or maybe even an event is scheduled to happen and you have some time to kill. It all meant arcades were a great time killer and social gathering spot for everybody who wanted to spend time together. It also helps that they were near key locations of places like stations, restaurants, or shops. It's not really a common thing to just have everybody visit your house to hang out and wait, when all of your friends take these methods to travel like you do, or one of you already lives in the city. So by 1998, Data East was pretty much going out of business in the gaming realm, that the Japanese division withdrew completely from the arcade industry, only moving to make games within the console market. They had accrued a 3.3 billion yen debt, which equated to 28.7 million US dollars or 29.4 million today. The US division of Data East was then liquidated a year later in 1999 as a result of plummeting sales within the pinball market, which was primarily made in the US. Which might explain why we never got an English version of Magical Drop F, as that game released on PlayStation consoles in October 21st of 1999 that same year. Moving forward from here, Data East sold ion generators as well as licensing their old games to other development companies, as this was all an effort for them to continue their video game business while paying off their debts. It wouldn't be until April of 2003 where Data East filed for bankruptcy. Wait, what are ion generators? Okay, so an ion generator is basically like an air purifier using some electrically charged, or rather ionized air molecules using high voltages. Holy crap, that's pretty lit actually. Damn. Anyway, many of Data East properties are currently owned by Gmode, a mobile game developer who has used some of the properties like Magical Drop to make their own versions of those games on mobile devices during the rising age of phones becoming more technically capable and becoming devices beyond the use of pure communication. Magical Drop F, an exclusive game for the PlayStation 1. As I have said, this was released on October 21st of 1999, and from what I can find was met with a positive reception overseas, but This can come down to many factors when you look at the context of its release at the time. 1999 was like a tipping point for that generation of consoles, where voice acting, CGI cutscenes, and CD quality music had become the norm of what to expect out of a game. Especially when the Dreamcast was now available and wowing people with even cleaner and refined visuals than the competition at the time. Magical Drop already having a reputation for quality in all of these areas, with the difference between sprite animated scenes and music from whatever soundboard the Neo Geo machines had. So it was no doubt expected to take advantage of these changes in the console market, with big names already established like Final Fantasy, Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and even Sonic Adventure, all being examples of the quality expected, along with their puzzler competitors already having console entries like Bust a Move and Puyo Puyo. They had to make sure they at least matched their quality if they wanted to make a splash. This is the generation where gaming started to mimic movies, but also become incredibly experimental with how to present their games. Narrative-focused games hit it big here, able to take advantage of the many things people wanted out of their games like voice acting, along with like what I call an unhealthy focus on graphics, at least here in the States from my own experience growing up around it, which all further started to leave behind the beautiful sprite work you used to see around right before 3D polygons hit the forefront, which wouldn't really make much of a return, only being used within portable gaming consoles like the Game Boy Advance, PlayStation Portable, and DS many years later, which is why visuals of this period have not aged very well at all. But, in fairness, this has developed to be like an aesthetic people are fond of, I mean me included. Like just look at most indie horror games today, like people love their low poly count models. There's just some charm to that. With all that in mind, it's not a mystery to me why Magical Drop F was received fairly well. It has hand-drawn animations this time, it has the CD quality music, and has plenty of voice acting. Along with these changes, they even drastically changed the art style and look of Magical Drop, going for a more serious looking tone with the new character designs and overall presentation of the game. The game no longer has that bubbly, colorful, cute look to it. Instead it is a much more like mature and serious like shonen anime look. However, to me it does come off far less interesting to look at and has a strong sense of wanting to fit in. Puyo Puyo N released earlier in the year and also sports this much more serious art design for their characters. But I cannot blame the shift in direction too much because again, this generation of gaming was really focused on appearances and being looked at as cutting edge and the entertainment equivalent to a movie. Games had a lot to prove during this time to catch the attention of the general public. It's that, that whole, look at us, we are on that level now, we have serious stories and experiences. Despite the fact that, well, they always had them. Like usual, let's jump into the development team for this entry of Magical Drop, which is full of a lot of new names. Masayuki Hiroki was the director for Magical Drop F, who previously has worked on other Data East games like Fighter's History and Data East RPG series Heracles no Echo. His latest role was design director for LBX Little Battlers Experience, which is like a toy mecha JRPG for the PSP and 3DS. He was also specially thanked in Magical Drop 1. Hiromichi Nakamoto was producer and had planning roles for Magical Drop 2 and 3, while also being specially thanked in all 3 games. He had production roles for Metal Max and Heracles no Echo. Tatsumi Sugiura is credited as planner, with special thanks from the WonderSwan version of Magical Drop, released the same year as Magical Drop F. Most recently, he was the scenario writer for the game Black Clover Quartet Knights. There are also 3 credited programmers for Magical Drop F. First being Motohiro Yumeki, second Keiichi Hinata, and lastly Tsuyoshi Takahashi. Motohiro Yumeki had previously did programming for Data East Heracles no Echo, and then he would go on as producer for games like Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy and a sequel Curtain Call. Keiichi Hinata also had a support credit for Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy, but most recently was part of management for the game Fire Pro Wrestling, which was released back in 2017. Tsuyoshi Takahashi, I can only find a couple works, both being the same series, which is a Doraemon side-scroller, one that was on a Super Nintendo, and another one that was on both the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. Now for the biggest crew on the development team. graphic designers, and this is most likely because all of the art is completely different from the previous entries. I'm going to focus on the designers that not just have a little more info about them out there, but also those that played a bigger role in the look of the game, because the vast majority of these designers seem to have almost nothing about them out there, at least nothing that is in English for me to accurately read. A. Coco is listed as the character designer, though there's no other information regarding this Coco, so just like Magical Drop 3, we don't really know who's primarily responsible for the look of these characters' designs. I took a look at the 3 art directors for the game. First listed is Yoshihiro Nagamori, but the only work they have done is as an animation director for Revive Sosei on Dreamcast the same year, and character design for Beyblade V-Force on Game Boy Advance years later. Shinichi Tanimura was art director for Revive Sohei as well, and lastly, Masayuki Yoroki did graphic design in previous Data East games like Fighter's History and Heracles no Echo. So none of the art directors seem to have any indication they are also Coco. As for the rest of the graphic designers, we have T. Sato, who evidently also helped compose music for Fantastic Night Dreams, Cotton, under that game's composer. Mari Yoshimura, also known as Rebels, who also did field model designs for the game Onimusha Dawn of Dreams on PlayStation 2. Yukio Morimoto is an interesting name to find here under art design, as they are still designing today, though it seems less on the art side of things. Morimoto has been a design director for games like Mario Kart Super Circuit on the Game Boy Advance, and Grandia 3 on PlayStation 2 of all things. And this surprised me most as a huge fan of that trilogy of JRPGs. They were also part of the battle system design of Paper Mario Color Splash and Origami King. Definitely the most active name to find thus far. Atsubi Takino, also known as Onion Egg, was also a design director for the game Tetris Plus on PlayStation a few years before this game. Kanako Mishiro, who later became the character artist for the game Time Hollow on DS, along with Shigekazu Maki, who happened to be the development director of that same game. Shigekazu Maki also worked on 2D illustrations for Black Clover, Quartet Knights, and production progress for the visual novel Steins Gate Zero. Yoshiyasu Matsushita, also known as Casio Matsushita, has quite the history and active involvement in many projects. He has primarily done work in art design, involving compilations with the TurboGrafx 16 Mini, Sega Genesis Mini, and Namco Museum Volume 1 being his most recent. Although he also did character design work for Senshin Celeste in 2021, which is the most recent entry in the shoot 'em up series of LS games. He also was one of the directors for Mega Man X Legacy Collection and manager for Super Bomberman R. Takumi Matsume, whose only other crediting I could find was coloring for the visual novel Steins Gate Zero, released in 2015. Noboku Narita, also known as Tenkiko, like Shigekazu Maki and Kanako Mishiro, she was also part of the development for Time Hollow, but as development producer, along with 2D illustration support for Black Clover. She has also been the producer of the games Spectrobes and Spectrobes Beyond the Portals on DS. And now we are at the sound designers, which interestingly, despite this game having tons of new names, is actually familiar. Because it's, of course, Hiroaki Yoshiya, or Maro, Asaki Iwasaki, or Koramasa, Tatsuya Kiyuchi as Kei, and lastly, Yoko Kawashima. Now for the voice actors, which, just like Magical Drop 3, I'll present the characters they voiced to speed things along. All of them are new. The Fool and the Star are both voiced by Yui Horie, who also happens to be the Japanese voice for Chie Satanoka from the game Persona 4, and Hitomi from the Dead or Alive series. The Magician is voiced by Koki Miyata, who has done voices for Chihiro Fujisaki from Danganronpa, Trigger Happy Havoc, and Chojuro within the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm games. The High Priestess and Justice are both voiced by Yuko Mizutani, who also did voice work for Katana in Namco X Capcom on PlayStation 2 and Project X Zone 2. Along with some roles in Kingdom Hearts, most notably Minnie Mouse in Kingdom Hearts 3D Dream Drop Distance. The Empress and Daughter Strength are both voiced by Ari Orikasa, who has done voice work for many games like Fire Emblem Three Houses and Valkyrie Profile, though her exact characters aren't listed, with the exception of Pietro in Return of Popo LaCroix, A Story of Seasons, Barbarella from Residents of Fate, and Gina Sage in Tales of Crestoria. The Emperor is voiced by Keita Nishihara. The Hierophant and the Sun was voiced by Mari Mashiba. The Lovers and the World were both voiced by Satomi Kurogi, who has done a ton of voice work, with her most frequent role being Mei from the Guilty Gear series. Chariot and the Tower are both voiced by Hideki Ogihara, who has been part of the voice cast for Shenmue 1 and 2, and was Devilbat Shilt in Mega Man ZX, among other voices for Mega Man 03. Strength and the Hangman are both voiced by Ken Yamaguchi, who has done Adjunct from Final Fantasy XII, The Zodiac Age. The Hermit and the character Burns was voiced by Takayasu Usui, who also has done additional voices from Final Fantasy XII. Wheel of Fortune and the Devil are both voiced by Naoko Matsui, who has voiced Corellia in Baten Kaitos and its prequel, Baten Kaitos Origins. Death and Temperance are both voiced by Yuka Tokimitsu, who has voiced Rika from Digimon World Next Order. The Moon was voiced by Nanako Itsumi. And lastly, Judgment was voiced by Tomoko Kawakami, who's done work as Rina in the classic Radiant Silvergun, and Mei from the King of Fighters series. So now let's jump into the main event, shall we? Magical Drop F. I don't know what the F means, but it doesn't really matter. I can at least say though it's a fun F and not a fail F. After the opening logos, Magical Drop F presents an opening video, which I actually found pretty cool. It shows off the characters and a new look and feel for the entire game that it's sporting, kicking up that energy the player would be taking part in. I always enjoy when a game has a special opening video and theme song. Like, sometimes I'll just literally turn on a game and watch that whole opening video and do that every single time I come back to play the game. Sometimes. Other times when the video is a little too long, it's like, okay, I just want to jump in and play. But Magical Drop 3 also had this as well, and even a hand-drawn animated version of that same opening for its console ports. So they still got it. Mechanically, at its core, the game is still very similar to Magical Drop 3. In fact, it's so similar, I had a hard time finding many key differences. Characters still cause their own special drop patterns after initiating a chain, though I did notice characters having more effective drop patterns than before, and the game seems to move at a slower overall pace. But I think that has to do with how dramatically this new item system that's newly introduced in this entry of Magical Drop has altered the gameplay. Before I get to the items though, I should state that as far as new block types, there doesn't seem to be any. As a matter of fact, there seems to be fewer block types, with the only two being bubbles and ice blocks. As a reminder, the bubbles require you to squish them to get them out of the way by shooting a drop at the column they reside in, or grabbing them outright. Ice blocks can only be removed by clearing the colored drops it's touching within its column, and will clear as the color you use to clear it with. So clearing an ice block touching a blue drop will remove all the ice blocks on the board and clear as blue drops. There are 3 item types in the game. These item types are explained to you in the story mode by person, and don't worry, we will be getting into the story mode plenty later. The item types are the attack type, the defense type, and the clown type. The attack type basically increases your chains. An example would be doing a chain of 4, but when activating the item, it becomes a chain of 5 or higher, depending on the item instead, like a plus modifier in dice rolls. These seem to be the most common item type I kept running into during the story mode. You can see here, the High Priest using an item, and after it activates, you can see that each chain is getting an increase of 3 that is being added again and again as the chain keeps going. The defense type can do multiple things, like counter an opponent's drop right back at them, or a clear drop that an opponent sends to you, basically nullifying their attack. All items that counter other items also count as defense types. For example, Fortune's default item is able to copy her opponent's item and use it against them. The clown type can also do multiple things, but they are essentially items that impact the clown avatar that the player controls on the board. Some items may freeze them or slow them down, or even increase your own speed. These also seem to be far more difficult to come across playing the game compared to the other 2 types, but only because the vast majority of clown items seem to be character default items. For example, the Magician's default item is a rose, and this item can cause the drops that your opponent is holding to randomly swap to another color, or even ice blocks over a set period of time. It's clear to me though, that some characters have very powerful items by default, and others have far more situational or weak items. Temperance's item ability is to literally put her opponent to sleep for a number of seconds, which I find to be pretty aggravating, while others have items that do as little as increase a chain attack by +2 or 3. While still incredibly useful, being able to just stop your opponent from acting is very strong in a puzzler like this, even if it's just for a few seconds. This item system throws an entirely new layer onto an already pretty in-depth puzzler. Magical Drop 3 was intense, but it was a manageable chaos. But Magical Drop F is a frenzy of chaos, as you actively try to not just play well with small pattern reading, quick reaction and timing, but also using your items at the right moments and staying knowledgeable about what each of the items do, along with choosing the right items to go into a Magical Drop battle, which will no doubt depend on the character you use. So with these items, the way they work is that during a Magical Drop encounter, you have the option to press triangle and trigger the item you have. After the item is activated, it will have a number appear over it, indicating a sort of cooldown. I say sort of because this cooldown doesn't count down with time, but instead counts down with drop clears. So every time you clear a drop, the number will decrease towards being able to use the item again. However, if you have multiple items at once, with the maximum limit being 3 items, then the topmost item will be used first, and the cooldown will count down so long as the next item you have under it is not triggered. If you do trigger your next item, then you will not be able to decrease the cooldown of the first item until that second item finishes its cooldown first. It's like an accumulated cooldown you build up when you use multiple items in a row before their cooldowns end. Despite these rules, there are some exceptions. Some items are one-time use, and therefore do not follow any sort of cooldown rule, so if you have one of those as one of your items, it will not affect your accumulated cooldown. In addition to all of this, the items available to the player is going to depend entirely on what mode they are playing in. So since I want more people to give this game a shot, I decided to list all the items I managed to collect in the game and compile a list of what they do. Or at least what I have seen the items do or what I think they do, all at the end of the video. So if you need an easy reference, the list will be there at the end of the video, as very little to no guides exist of this game. I've also placed screenshots of old tips I managed to find during the research I had done for it. And if anyone has any corrections or anything like that, please let me know and I'll update it. Since this is a home console exclusive release with no arcade version equivalent, there are actually plenty of modes to play here. When you hit start at the title menu, you are presented with cards as the menu items, which I found pretty neat. You have battle mode, endless mode, RPG mode, and the option mode. There is also a theater/gallery mode, but I was not able to ever access this for whatever reason. I'll do my best to detail and explain each of these modes, as well as giving visual translations for everything I can. Battle mode is the first option presented to you, and there are 3 card options here. The first card on the left, solo mode, is very much like an arcade mode from previous games where you face multiple opponents in a row in magical drop battles until you reach the end where your score will be tallied. You can also choose 3 different difficulty options, with the very left being easy, middle for normal, and on the right for hard. Though a key difference here, and by extension a difference about Magical Drop F as a whole, is you will be using the selected character's default item during their fights. Because in this game, each character in the game has a single item they can use, with the exception of the world who has no items. And I'll get into why that is not a bad thing a bit later. The second card in the middle is the Versus mode, where you and another player can pit your skills against each other, either using each character's default item, or using the items a player has collected within the story of the RPG mode. Each player has the option to load save data from a memory card in slot A or B on the PlayStation to load their RPG mode data that contains their item collection. But both players can also use the same memory card as well if they wanted to. Like if you're playing with a friend and only one of you has even played the RPG mode. Choosing to use RPG save data means you forego the item your selected character uses by default, unless you also happen to have that character's default item in your collection from the save data. This Versus mode is also the only other mode in the game where you can use the items collected from the RPG mode. So to put it simply, all the stuff you collect, all the items you get for the RPG mode are only useful within that same mode or the Versus mode against another player. So remember how the Neo Geo Pocket version of Magical Drop 3 had you facing your opponent in a sort of hybrid, endless, and arcade style mode? Well, surprisingly, that is what this last card on the right is. You are faced with opponent after opponent non-stop, and you must drain their life with chain attacks. For simplicity, I'm going to call this the Pocket Battle mode. This is also the most difficult mode to play simply due to the fact that the enemy constantly recovers their health in a short amount of time. This means you have to create a lot of large chains to defeat them. I'm no master at Magical Drop, and I never claimed to be, but I couldn't even make it past the third encounter, the High Priestess, because I just could not keep those chains up to whittle down her health faster than she can recover it. In this mode, you cannot use any RPG save data, and your character does not come with their standard default item. Instead, you have a few options of item sets, each containing 3 items you can use during this mode. Next is the Endless mode, which is similar to previous games where you are faced with an endless barrage of line dropping patterns and must survive as long as possible, with the challenging ramping up higher and higher the longer you last. In regards to item use, you are required to select a set just like you would in the Pocket Battle mode. Lastly, it's the RPG mode. An RPG is used pretty loosely here too. Now, I'm not going to get into what constitutes an RPG, especially considering the differences between Western and Eastern perceptions of the genre here, most likely in a separate video, but I will say it's never good to keep your mind rigid on genre labels as they constantly grow and change with time. And genres exist to help us identify why we play games within them. It's not supposed to be about filling a checklist to categorically fit within them. Otherwise, you get mixed results and confusion, especially when you try to force something in a genre because it does so many things. Some games can be bigger than the boxes we are using to stuff them in, as history in gaming has shown us time and time again. When launching this RPG mode, it throws us into an introduction of the world of Magical Drop, how no one knows where this magical land exists, and that it only exists within a magical book. It explains that somewhere within this land, there are magical drops capable of granting any wish, but that they are also capable of changing fate. The person narrating goes on, and they have been searching and fighting to find all the magical drops. How they, being the goddess World, does what she can to not let the drops fall into the wrong hands, hiding them away so they are not found, but then... And it comes to our lead character, Justice. This was something I definitely didn't expect. I guess it would be tough to pinpoint a singular protagonist for an RPG adventure, considering all the characters are quite eccentric and have plenty of odd and silly quirks to them. On top of that, no one character seemed to get more spotlight than the others with the exception of the villains in all the previous games. So the character Justice starts her journey here, walking through a forest in the rain, trying not to get wet or catch a cold. But she quickly decides staying under a tree isn't going to be enough, so she ventures off to town. Once she arrives, she gets smacked by a giant red orb that she identifies as some kind of candy, after it starts to move. Though I believe the magical drops are enlarged here for the player's convenience, because I don't think with the sprite size they'd be able to indicate just exactly what hit her. But anyway, I am quite literally roughly translating this myself with the help of some Google Translate. So I have at least some understanding of the things happening in this story, but I'm unsure how much of the story in previous games is even taken into account here. And that it's because it appears this is the first time Justice is seeing a magical drop at all, so I'm not exactly sure. The red magical drop then connects with her sword, and then Justice kind of looks down and stares at it. And she becomes disappointed she was hit by something so small. In the same moment, a voice is trying to speak to her. The voice reveals herself to be the goddess, the World, and tells Justice to meet her at the lake. Once Justice arrives at the lake to meet the World, and the World begins to explain to her that the red orb she saw and the blue one she is holding, that, while looking like candy, are actually magical drops, and that there exists 7 of them. She goes on to explain that she has been watching them, and that she doesn't let anyone touch them, because she can't just let anyone try to fulfill their wishes. So the way it works is that whoever's wishes are granted for as long as nobody else tries to make a wish after them. So she keeps the magical drops hidden to maintain the current wishes from the last person who used them. A new wish erases the previous wish, basically. When Justice asks what the wish was, the World says it was a seal. In this case, the wish was to seal Fortune, who manages destiny. And she made that wish after gathering all 7 magical drops because Fortune is too powerful. That is also why there was thunder and rain happening, because a recent wish was made that basically broke the seal. The drops also have a mind of their own, being drawn to different characters, and why the red drop shot towards Justice and her sword. Essentially, Justice was chosen by the red drop. The World then pleads with Justice to find the remaining 6 magical drops to reignite the wish of sealing away Fortune. And despite her reluctance, she does eventually agree. The World then challenges Justice to a magical drop battle to test her strength for the journey ahead. Essentially the tutorial fight. The World explains that the Sword of Justice has a new power after integrating with the red magical drop, that power being one of the special items in the game. As mentioned before, every character has their own special item that they can trigger within a match at any time by pressing triangle. For the purposes of this mode, you are able to carry up to 3 of these special items into one match, and you slowly unlock more items as you progress through the story, often obtained by winning against other characters in a magical drop match. After the match is over against the World, Justice obtains the blue magical drop. Having 2 of the 7 in hand, she sets off to search for the rest, and the journey then truly begins. I will say, this mode definitely grew on me as I continued to play it. Even though I was slowly and roughly translating everything myself, I did start to become more invested into the journey. All the major characters make an appearance here in this mode, with many little moments and character interactions that are pretty entertaining and even funny. The hijinks Justice finds herself getting into gave a few good chuckles and memorable moments. The main story at hand isn't anything special to write home about, as the characters were always the highlight of the series, but they are expressed accurately to what you'd expect the characters to be, despite the change in art style and presentation. So this mode actually got me to feel an even bigger fondness for all of the characters, and gave me moments of, oh man, I wonder who's going to show up next, and oh, of course she would do that, or moments of like, wait, is that the Hangman? Basically surprised excitement throughout. Justice runs into the Hierophant, who complains and hates thunderstorms. Temperance, who brags how much sleeping she does, how she loves sleep and only wants to sleep all the time. The Fool, who even in Japanese still speaks nothing but gibberish despite the fact Justice can understand him with no issue at all. Judgment, who comes off angry and aggressive because her trumpet concert sign became knocked over? I think? The Devil, who does everything to get in Justice's way, including stealing magical drops you had just earned. The Hangman, who plays tricks on Justice. The Star, who is fixated on running her concert like some kind of Japanese idol for everybody. The Lovers, who seems to be a close friend of Justice, but also seems to have her own agenda and secrets she alludes to. Strength, who appears hypersensitive and a huge softie, even crying and running away when Justice tries to get past him. The Hermit, who apparently trained both Justice and the Chariot, but is always complaining about how the Chariot is a stupid idiot. The Chariot himself, who straight up challenges Justice as a lowly, weaker rival. Daughter Strength, who looks like a little kid this time, like way younger than Magical Drop 3, and she doesn't have any of the fierce attitude she had before either. Probably because her age was scaled down a bunch, but she is here looking for her father with her lion companion Gao Gao. Eventually you run into the Empress, who was the one ordering the Devil to steal your well-earned magical drops and having Strength guard the path leading to her. Then there's the High Priestess, who has been chasing after the Fool, and she seems unable to actually understand what the Fool says, despite being a very intelligent, bookwormy character. Nearing the end, once you've returned to town, you see a building destroyed, and the Magician, Temperance, and Judgment are here. The tower seems to be causing destruction, and they need your help to defeat him. This is an interesting moment as it's the only time actual danger is being caused to the area. So you fight the tower, and then after defeating the tower, the world shows up and explains that the tower is the work of the Wheel of Fortune herself. The Lovers is also here, and slips that she had the pink magical drop this whole time, and quickly runs away. Moving on, Death herself also shows up and threatens Strength, but with Justice there, she kind of just runs away, which came as a very bizarre interaction that seemed to be missing context. Once you catch up with the Lovers at the lake, she explains she just defeated Death. At least I believe that's what she's saying. And then she hands you the pink magical drop. So as far as I can tell, I'm guessing the Lovers has said something to Death so that Death wouldn't actually try and do a battle with Justice. But I'm not completely sure. With 6 of the 7 magical drops in hand, now all that was left is to face Fortune herself for the final piece. When entering her domain, you fight against the tower again. Then, a strange fight against yourself in this dimensional mirror-looking place. Then you enter the final room, where Fortune is standing waiting for you. She tells Justice how she was expecting her arrival. Justice then states that the world said, without the magical drop, Fortune is practically unbeatable. And Fortune comments how unfortunate it is to be tied by the chains of fate, as if her destiny, and Justice's destiny, was always meant to be. After the final battle is over, Fortune hands you the final magical drop and the ending begins to play. This is the mode that, while at first seemed like a roadblock to be able to experiment with the item system the game has, since in other modes each character by default only has one item or you're forced to select a set, it turned out to be an entertaining experience. I adore the characters in this series, so seeing them all interact with wacky situations was a treat. This also made the game's presentation and different art style grow on me. I still at the end of the day prefer the look of Magical Drop 3, but Magical Drop F's aesthetic still works, and I can see the appeal it has. Though I will say this mode is stupidly easy, like the opponents here hardly put up any kind of fight, which would be my only major criticism of the mode, along with not having a clear indication when the game will save your progress along the story, despite saving the items you collected. So if you plan to play through this RPG mode, I recommend doing it in one sitting, and thankfully it's not very long at all, and it's very possible to do it in one go. One cool addition is that after you beat the RPG mode, you actually unlock another story mode where you play as the Lovers and get to see her side of the events. This side would probably explain why Lovers was being so sus in her behavior, especially hoarding the pink magical drop and her encounter with Death. This is also where you will find more items to use in battle that you can't find in Justice's side of the story. So what if you want to play Magical Drop F? Well, it's kind of a crapshoot no matter where you look. The game used to be available on the PlayStation Network store for PS3s a decade or so ago in all regions by Monkey Paw Games. but has sadly been removed from the US and EU storefronts. And make no mistake, this was not translated just because it was available for English speakers to buy and download. It is still available on the Japanese storefront though if you happen to have a Japanese PlayStation Network account, but again, this is only available through PlayStation 3. I also don't know if it's easily transferable to a PSP if you still have that set up to connect your PSP to the PS3. Importing is an option obviously if you have a working PlayStation 1, 2, or 3, and from the listings I saw it's pretty cheap. But lastly, of course, you can always just emulate it. So yeah, that's Magical Drop F. In conclusion, I would say it is a worthy entry into the series. I wouldn't say it's better than Magical Drop 3, but it definitely has a much larger single player component compared to Magical Drop 3. The item system, while adding layers of complexity to the game that are robust and can result in a huge variety of strategies, can also cause a lot of frustration and extreme one-sidedness compared to simply being unable to react quickly enough to your opponent's drops in previous games. I wouldn't mind seeing this item system again, but in a much more refined and balanced approach. Because, as I have said, some characters just have some pretty ridiculous items, regardless how long that cooldown for it is. The modes available are satisfying and fun, and the story mode, especially, is a good time, even if its difficulty is practically non-existent. Though I do wish there were more modes where you could play with the items you collected instead of being solely used for the RPG and versus modes. Now I didn't get the opportunity to play against a human player, but I imagine it could be pretty fun experimenting with the different item sets and character combinations, creating a whole different meta to a pretty untapped game competitively. And that is Data East's finale of Magical Drop. We would not see another sliver of Magical Drop until G Mode, the current owners of Magical Drop, where they decided to do some mobile ports. And we wouldn't see a full-blown sequel until nearly a decade after Magical Drop F, that being Magical Drop 5. However, there is a problem. Magical Drop 5 is no longer available to buy and download, as it has been taken down from distribution for a long time, with only its demo being available. I will cover the demo in the future, but unfortunately I have not been able to find a reliable source to be able to play the full version of Magical Drop 5. And even if it exists somewhere, it being updated is also another factor. Whatever the case, I'll do what I can, and if I am unable to attain the full version, there are a couple other Magical Drop related things I have been wanting to add that aren't the core games that we've talked about. But anyway, I've chatted enough. I'm Timmy Tryhard, have a pleasant day, and I'll see you all for Magical Drop 5 and whatever else I come up with. Bye.